Welcome back. This week we are going to be exploring how to make one of these. I'm going to be showing you how to make a koi carp shadow puppet. It's actually a very simple puppet. All I've used is some bamboo skewers, some cereal packet cardboard this week. So normally I use a kind of thicker cardboard like a box, but actually if you've got access to something like a cereal packet that's a little bit thinner, then I'd recommend using one of those this week. And that's so that we can create these holes that I've made with ease, rather than with the other kind of cardboard that's a little bit thicker. And you only need some very simple materials other than your cardboard and other than a trusty pencil and a pair of scissors. You will need some sellotape. Just simple normal sellotape's fine, or if you have other type of tape, that's also okay. But we're using sellotape today because it's clear and see-through. So it's handy if you're going to tape over any holes for your shadow puppet, you'll be able to see through it. A piece of paper, because we're going to be doing a little bit of drawing if you've got one of those. And the final thing that you'll need is some tracing paper. And if you don't have any tracing paper at home, you can also use baking paper, the kind of stuff that you might use to cook something on, because it's just as see-through. It's a little bit more difficult to see through, but it works just as well. So you don't need to go and get anything special from the art shop. And the other thing is these bamboo skewers that I'm a big fan of, the kind of things you can get at the supermarket for doing kind of barbecues. Or if you don't have access to those, you can also use a kind of garden stick, those green ones you can get as well. Oh, and one last thing as well, to attach everything together, I'm using a type of wire this week. Now I've got wire on a roll, but if you have any paper clips at home at all, then you can use paper clips too. All you need is that kind of bendy wire like this. And if you don't have anything like that, don't worry, we can use string as well, because it's just to tie things through to create a kind of joint. Let's begin. So to make our koi carp, we are going to start off with thinking about how we want our puppet to look. And as per usual, I'll always say to you that though I'm going to teach you how to make this puppet today, you don't have to be limited to what I'm making. In fact, if you've got another kind of character you'd like to design, I'd recommend that you have a go exploring what's in your imagination. All of the principles of making a shadow puppet will be the same, regardless of whether or not you decide to make a fish or another kind of creature. So the first thing we're going to do is think about designing our puppet on paper in 2D. And the reason that we do that first is that it allows us to think about where we want to make our puppet move. And as you can see with my fish, with my koi carp, it's been jointed in quite specific places to allow it this swimming motion. It's got a tail that's got a control to it, so you can have that kind of flick. And it's got an attachment point to the head as well. And I've allowed its fins at the top to just be quite free moving, so that you get a real sense of fluidity with the puppet. So the first thing we're going to do is think about drawing this and imagining where those points will be for movement. Here we are. I've got my paper and I want to think about drawing my koi carp. So I find that because these koi carp are always shown to be swimming, they tend to always be drawn in this kind of arc shape. But what I'm going to try and do as best as I can is draw it in more of a straight line, which isn't so easy. There might be a bit of a curve. So I'm going to start off with creating the body and the head. And down to the tail here. They've got a lovely big tail, these fish, often. If you've ever seen them in real life, they get really, really big, and these are really beautiful and thin. So it's lovely to be able to think about letting the light through in areas that are more translucent in real life. Then I'm going to add on the fins over here. And again, same thing, thinking about how they might look when they're moving. And they tend to have, I actually think they've got a bit more of an oval shaped head than I've given it initially. So I'll just redraw that. They normally have quite big eyes at the side here too. And they have those funny little whiskers at the front, koi carp, which are quite nice to add in as well. And then they normally have those two little fins at the back here, something like that. Yeah, so you end up with a kind of a rough sketch really of what your koi carp can look like. And again, if you need to use a reference, you can always use a reference material online, but you're aiming for something like this. The first thing that I want to do once I've drawn my picture is to think about where it is that I want my puppet to have movement. And as you can see with the puppet before, there's some quite specific points where I've allowed the movement to happen. So we'll start with the tail here. What I want to think about is creating an overlap. I'm imagining that I'm going to be creating this in card, and the card is going to need to overlap to create a pivot point. So I'm going to draw that overlap and put a dot where my pivot point would be for movement, like this. Yeah. So I've got the overlap and the pivot point, which means that when I'm going to recreate this in my card, I will be able to know exactly how much I need to have cut out. If you don't allow enough overlap, then sometimes what happens is your puppet won't move exactly as you want, because it doesn't have that chance to have this kind of pivot effect. It's a little bit restricted, so make sure you're quite generous with that. So the next place I'm going to do is around here, and I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm imagining that there's this piece here with a pivot point there, and then the last piece is probably going to be somewhere over here at the back of the head, so let's draw that one in there and put a pivot point there. And then I've got my two fins at the front here. Want to make sure there's a nice overlap there onto the body, and I'm going to put my pivot points roughly here. So what you're going to end up with is a drawing that roughly shows you, it's a technical drawing essentially, how your puppet is going to be attached together when you're creating it out of card. I've made sure that I've put an overlap with a pivot point in a good place. And what that means is that I'm now able to explore if this is actually going to work effectively. So this is where we're going to move on to using our tracing paper or our baking paper. I'm going to number my head as number 1. Then the middle section of the body is number 2. The section at the end of the body there as number 3. The tail as number 4. And then the fins can be 5 and 6. So what you're looking to do is create a really clear plan of the amount of parts you're going to need to cut out separately. And that's really important, that obviously what you would do normally is then draw this separately. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come and take my tracing paper. And I've already drawn something on here to show you why it's really, really helpful. So I'm just going to move my drawing over to the side for a second so that I can show you this. It's a little bit faint here, but what I've done is drawn the head of my puppet onto my tracing paper. So I've traced over my drawing, okay? And then I've traced over number 2, the second part of my fish as well, there. And what it means that I can do is, without having to do anything to my drawing, I can just double check by overlapping those 2 pieces together to make sure that if I hold the pivot point okay, that the movement is really nice. Do you see? So all I'm doing is checking that those parts work together, that there's not any overlap, that I've allowed enough space between, and it means that you can refine your design if you want to. So if you're designing a puppet that you know is going to go into shadow, this allows you to just tweak that design as you go along and make sure you're really, really happy with the quality of the movement you're going to get. So what that then also means is that you're tracing over the individual sections of your puppet. So if it helps you to, what you can then do, if it helps you to think about moving this from paper onto cardboard, you can then draw those 6 sections separately so that you can actually just move them straight onto the card with ease. Now, depending on how confident you are as a drawer, some of you might be watching thinking this doesn't look very difficult at all. That's fantastic. If you're confident to just draw that straight onto cardboard, then you can go straight ahead. But it might be that you're designing something with a little bit more of a complicated pattern. You might be doing something that you want to have more detail in. So this is a good opportunity to use this technique if you're going to be exploring doing other designs. But for now, what I'm going to do today is just move straight onto the cardboard using a little bit of my tracing paper design to show you how that would work in theory. So I've got a good idea of what I want my koi carp to look like. I've made sure that my design is refined, and I've also very handily decided to draw onto my tracing paper. Now, I'm sure many of you have used tracing paper before, but I find that with shadow puppets, it's a very, very useful piece of kit to have, because not only are you able to refine the design, but then what you can also do is just use it to then trace onto the card directly. So it just allows you to, if you've spent a long time really refining a puppet design that you're really happy with, it allows you to have an exact copy of that design. It's also useful if you're going to make more than one of the same thing. So I'm tracing here around the head of the koi carp. And I'm making sure that I'm tracing over that pivot point that we decided on, because that's a really useful thing to have an idea of where it is. I've also put onto here these scales that you can see. Now, this detail here is actually where I'm going to decide to make some holes in the puppet to let the light through. That's what allows more detail into it. So I've got a really rough copy here of my fish, and I'm just going to go over that again. Make sure I get those whiskers, and any of those really smaller bits there, like the whiskers. A good piece of advice is as well not to make them too thin, because obviously when you're working with card, if you add in bits that are very, very thin, there's a chance that that will rip. Again, as per usual, I'm always explaining when we're working with card, the great thing about it is that if you do rip it, you can just use some tape to put it back together, so don't worry too much. But it's something to think about moving forward, because it allows you to just refine exactly what it is you want to create and make sure you don't have to do double the work later. So I've transferred my head onto the card now, and I'm going to continue to do that piece by piece. So if you remember, going back to my design, this would have been the first section. I've drawn it out completely separately to the rest of the body, because I'm going to cut it out separately, and I'm going to do the second section there. So again, I have the second section already drawn out. So I'm going to use this to trace. I think I've got a much softer pencil here, so I'm going to just go over this side first, and then I'm going to flip it over and draw over that line again to help the graphite transfer onto the card. There we go. I'm going to add in a couple more scales here, just as a kind of reference where I think I want to let my light through. There we go. So now I'm into the final two sections. The last one is the tail, the third section here. I'm going to just see if I can draw that straight onto card. But again, remember, if you're not so confident with drawing, it's absolutely fine to use this tracing paper technique so that you get the exact design that you want. Making sure I'm putting in those pivot points again so that we know where everything's going to overlap. Adding in my scales. And on that section as well, there's those little fins here that I'm making sure are quite thick, so they're going to be easier for me to cut out. And that leads me to the nice big tail. I really love drawing fish tails anyway. They're beautiful things to draw. You can have a lot of fun with shadow puppets, especially with things that have a little bit more movement, feathers, scales, things like that. They allow you to put in a lot of lovely detail into your puppet. So if you are considering making another kind of creature, that's always worth thinking about. And I'm probably going to also add in a couple of simple lines, thinking about where I want to let the light through. And then the final thing I've got to draw is the fins on the side here. So just to show you where I'm up to now, you can see that all of those separate parts have been drawn separately. And the final thing is now the fins, and then I'll be ready to cut out. So one fin. And the other one. And I'm going to think again about drawing some lines onto my fins to let the light through there. So what you should have is this. It's kind of like all of the separate parts of your puppet. They've been drawn out. You've put some detail there where you know you'd like to let the light through. And it also means that you can just double check that your drawing is exactly as you'd like. And once you've got to that stage, then the next thing that you need to do is cut out. So I'm going to get my scissors now, and I'm going to start to cut these out. Seems like a really obvious piece of advice, this one, but what I always do is I try and cut each section out individually like this. It means that you can work on one piece at a time rather than using this huge piece of card. It's particularly useful if you're working with a harder card as well. So that's always my advice. If I was working on my own, I'd probably be really, really careful, and I'd move things really close together, because it means that you use less of your material. Obviously, when you're working with a cereal packet, that's less important because they're fairly easy materials to make. But say you were working with a clear acrylic plastic, which is something that I often do with shadow puppets, you want to make sure that you move those pieces close together, because then you won't waste your material. So probably a very obvious piece of advice, but one that I always try and mention to students. So let's start with cutting out my fish now. I'll start with the head. It's worth mentioning that if you have an interest in shadow puppetry, it's got a really wonderful and rich history. Some of the most famous types of shadow puppets are Indonesian, and often puppets are made using a type of leather, often from water buffalo. So when I talk about being careful with materials, if you can imagine that sometimes people are working with things like leather where they have very sharp tools, which allows them to make really beautiful markings. You can also make 3D shadows, which are really wonderful. But there's some fantastic techniques to create shadow puppets relatively easily. And the best thing about making them is that you can just work with a phone light to be able to play around with what they look like when you're working with them in the dark. So it's a really accessible form of puppetry, and it's something that actually, relatively speaking, is a really easy thing to explore. It's also a nice chance to translate things from the drawn world into the puppetry world. So, you know, there's some beautiful examples of people I've taught over the years who've not been so confident with drawing, and then actually they've got to make their own shadow puppet and discovered that it translates really, really beautifully. So yeah, it's something to do at home and pass the time with really easily. So as you can see, I've cut out 3 of my sections now, and this is a chance for me to really see that this is gonna work. So as I'm cutting out piece by piece, I'm making sure that that pivot point that I've put onto my drawing is going to be in the right place. And obviously, if it's not quite right, then this is the opportunity for you to redraw any section and recut that out to make sure that it's exactly what you want it to look like. So I'm just going to cut out the tail now. Make sure that's looking right. As I said, the tail's always my favourite bit. Similarly to if you've got something with feathers or something fantastical. It's really wonderful to draw things that have texture, because so often in shadow you can create that working with lots of different materials. So there's my fish tail. And then the final 2 things I've got to cut out here are obviously the fins. I've now cut out all of the parts of my puppet. I can put it together on the board here, and I'm able to really see how it goes together. And I'm pretty happy with how it's looking. The next thing I'm going to show you now is obviously how we create some holes to allow the light through. And you don't have to do this, to be clear. You know, a lot of puppets are just silhouette puppets, but there's something really magical about allowing some holes into your puppet, because it makes the puppet look much more detailed when you explore it in shadow. And actually what I'm doing here is quite a simple version of the patterning that you could explore. So, you know, if you have, for example, a craft knife at home and you're confident working with that, obviously they're very sharp, so disclaimer is to be very, very careful if you're working with that. You can get some really detailed, beautiful, beautiful holes cut into your puppet. So that's something to bear in mind. I'm just working with a pair of scissors today, and it's why I'm working with this thin cardboard. I'm happy with the detail I've put in. So, for example, you can see I've just put some lines on the tail here. And all I'm going to do to cut that out is, the first thing I'm going to accept is that it's likely and it's okay for me to cut holes in the puppet. I'm not trying to be super, super careful because it's just cardboard. And that means that I've got my sellotape here so that if anything goes wrong, I can just stick it back together. And because the sellotape is see-through, that's going to still allow the light through. So you're still going to be able to see any detail. So I'm going to start with the tail, and I'm actually going to just cut straight up in to the tail like this. And I'm going to cut out a kind of section. And I'm going to do a couple, and then I'll hold it up so that I can show you. But I'm keeping hold of the piece that I've cut out and making sure that I don't lose that. And I'll show you why in just a second. I'm also laying those pieces out in the order that they're coming out of the tail. So you end up with this kind of feathering. Now, of course, I could just leave this, but as you can see, it's meant that it's kind of weakened the cardboard a little bit. And I want to kind of try and make sure that this is as solid as possible, even though it's card. Our puppets are designed to be moved and used. So it's important that we bear that in mind. They're not just objects, but obviously I'm sure many of us can just stick them up somewhere beautiful and have a look at them separately. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to cut the ends of those three sections and slot it back into place here and tape it down. And all that will do is make sure that my puppet is a little bit stronger than if I'd let those pieces just go. So there's the first one there. And I'm going to slide that back up there like that. I'm going to do the same in a second. And this is why I put them in order, because otherwise I'm going to have lots of scraps of cardboard and I'm not sure which one's which. And there's the last one there. And I'm going to put this back together like this. So hopefully you can see that I've now attached these back together. And I'm going to take some sellotape and I'm just going to stick it down. And you can see that it's kind of scrappy around the edges, but what's great is that you can just fold it over and fold it at the bottom there. And what I've done is I've just managed to allow my puppet to be a bit stronger again. It's not got bits hanging around. So I'm going to do the same on the other side now. And I'm going to just do exactly the same thing that I've done on one side to the other side. So here's the first one. Same process exactly, where I'm going to make sure they're in the right place. Can be a bit of a fiddle, but you know, that's part of the fun sometimes, isn't it? The technique of getting it right. Once they're stuck down, oh, there we go. I'm going to make sure that the sellotape is nicely attached on the sides here. So I'm folding it over there. And actually, this is something to show you guys. If the sellotape just gets attached, obviously you can just cut it and fold it as well. The really great thing about this is that all of these materials are so simple to work with that you can't really make a mistake, because you can just really quickly rectify that. So I've ended up by cutting these holes where I've drawn those lines, which obviously when we shine the light through is going to let shadow, so it's going to give that detail. And because I'm going to do the same thing with the fins here, I'm just going to do exactly the same thing again with my fish fins. I'm going to cut these sections out here for some detail. Keep the little parts to make sure that I can reattach it together for strength, and then sellotape that down to let the light through. 1, 2, 3, like that. And this time I'm going to shortcut myself. I'm going to stick the tape down, flip it over, and then I'm going to cut and stick on the other side. So almost a nice quicker way rather than having to faff. There's the first one there. There's one fin. Just done exactly the same thing, cut out some shapes there to allow the light through, and the same on the other side. Lovely. So that means that I've finished my fish tail and my fish fins. I'm going to trim that sellotape off the side there, as long as it's secured those bits in place. So I've ended up with these, which means that I can now move on to the scales on the rest of the puppet. Now, obviously, these little scales, I've just drawn a little line where I want them to be. And all I'm going to do to be able to create that hole is I'm just going to fold the puppet along roughly the line where I want to cut. And then taking my scissors, I'm going to carefully cut in. And I'm holding it up to the camera so you can see. Obviously, when you're doing it, please be very careful when you're working with your scissors. So that there's a little section that's cut out from the top there. So you know it's almost like a nail. And I'm going to do the same thing again, just carefully cutting along. It almost looks like a little smile. That's almost what I'm cutting out there. And when you're cutting in detail like this to your fish, one thing to be really careful of is that you're making sure you're not too close to the pivot point, because obviously we want to make sure that we are allowing that to really move. Now, I've done it quite big so you can see, but all I've done there is just cut out through the fold. You can see where I've cut along here, and then I'm opening it up. Very, very similar to the kind of thing when you make the snowflakes where you fold your paper. And again, you can really explore what kind of techniques and patterns you want to create in your puppet through doing this. So I'll just repeat that on the other side. And again, if you were sort of thinking about creating another type of puppet, you know, say, for example, a bird or something, this would be a really nice technique to show kind of feathering and stuff. So again, it's all about creating that lovely detail. Some of the puppets I mentioned, the Indonesian wayang puppets that are created traditionally, the detail in them is absolutely beautiful. So I've cut out some scales on the puppet here, and I'm going to repeat that on these next two sections. Start with the middle one there. But you can sort of spend as long or as little time as you like on this kind of detail. The lovely thing is that the technique is there for you to explore, and the limits your imagination. Okay, so just to lay down what I've got so far so that you can see how things are going here. You can start to see where I've cut that detail in. And the final section now is the head. So I'm going to add in the scales first, just because that's exactly the same technique that I've just done on the rest of it. But then I want to make sure that I can create that sort of lovely line that the koi carp have on their head. If you look up a reference image of them, they're very, very beautiful fish, really varied, and they often have these amazing patternings on them as well. But I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna just cut that out completely in a second and tape the puppet back together, basically, so that I've got a clean line running throughout. I want to cut out this line of the head now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially cut my puppet's head off, not to be alarming, but I want to kind of cut out a strip. So if I draw that a little bit more clearly for you to see, the aim is to sort of remove the section I've just coloured in here, and then using sellotape to stick it back together. So cutting along the line there. And you can either cut the whole head off, but because I know I don't want to cut the whole thing off, I'm just leaving that attached. Cut the section out there, and I'm doing the same as I did with my tail and my fin, where I want to save the piece of card I'm cutting out, because I'm going to use that little section at the end here to stick it back together. So I'm going to just save that little bit there, like that. Just the same as I did with that. And then I'm going to use my tape to just make sure that my head is stuck back together for strength, like this. So I'm going to put sellotape on one side, I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to sellotape on the other side. That also means that you don't have a nasty sticky bit that will pick up all those tiny bits of fin that you've just been painstakingly carving out. And I'm going to trim the edge of my puppet. There we go. So I've just managed to cut this out here nicely. And the final bits for me to do are just the eyes. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to basically cut the eye out, make sure that I don't completely cut the side off, and then tape back over it. And one thing that I sometimes like to do if I'm making a human character is I cut the eyes out, cover it with sellotape, and then use a little pen to put a dot in so that you get a real sense of there being an actual eye. So I'll do one side and the other. So you can see I've pretty much cut them out there. And now I'm just going to stick that back down using my tape. And the same on this side here. Lovely. Okay. And once I'm happy that that's all reattached and everything's as it should be, now I just want to make sure that card is reattaching, or else I've got a floating eye, which I don't want there at all. Then I will just spend a moment trimming off those bits of sellotape that are overlapping here. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because when you put this up into shadow, that does actually pick up. The light will show the edges. So it's worth, if you can, if you've got the time, just going around the edge of your puppet and making sure it's a really nice clean edge. I'm just going to lay this out and have a look at it now. I'll make sure that that's going to have an attachment point there. Great. So hopefully now you can see my koi carp, and you can start to see how it's going to be able to move. Now, at the beginning of today, I said that if you could get hold of some bamboo skewers, they're quite useful things. I use them in quite a lot of my lessons, as you might have seen, and that's just because they have this wonderful sharp point. So it's really great for making holes in cardboard, basically. So what we're going to do now is we're going to using a rubber, and that's so that I can push down into the rubber. Otherwise you end up bending things a lot. I'm going to make the holes where we made those marks on our original drawing, on those pivot points. And this is where hopefully you haven't cut a scale exactly where you need to attach your puppet together. So it's a good chance to have a look. If you have, the great thing is that you can just use sellotape, go over the top of it, and then make a hole through that. So don't fear if that happens. I'll start off with the tail and work my way up to the head. So I'm going to put my rubber down here over the top there and just create that hole by pushing into it. And I always kind of allow my bamboo skewer to go all the way through on both sides, just to make sure that there's a nice loose hole there. Same thing again. Pop it down on the same place. If you don't have a bamboo skewer, don't worry, you can always just use a sharp biro. That works just as well, or you can sharpen a pencil and use that. It just tends to blunt my pencil whenever I do it, so I always prefer using these things because you can also then use them in your puppetry as well. That one. And there. I'm going to do the fins next, just to make sure that I can position them onto the body and make a mark exactly where I want the fins to be. So I'll come back to that in just a second. Okay. So I'm going to leave the fins till last, but I'm going to work my way up and attach these bits together. Now, as I said, I'm using this sort of bendable wire that you can get. But, you know, if you can't get hold of this, because it's just the sort of thing you might be able to get in a kind of like a B&Q or something, it's the sort of thing that you use for florist wire. I would recommend using paper clips because it's just as bendable, it's quite easy to work with. And if you don't have a paper clip, again, don't worry at all, string is just as good. All you're needing to do is tie a piece of string through the hole to make sure that it's attaching the two pieces of card together. That's the only purpose it's got. Wire is just a tiny bit easier to work with, so I'm going to work with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to thread my wire through the holes I've made, and then I'm just going to bend this, it's very flexible and soft, into a kind of loop like this, so that when I bend it flat, it's not going to pull out. So you end up with something that's attached on, and then you can just sort of like bend it into a kind of loop onto the other side, nice and simply. And if you're working with this kind of wire, the great thing is about it that you can just use scissors to cut it. It doesn't require any kind of pliers or anything. It's nice and easy. So you end up with your card attached together using wire. Just as I was saying before though, if you don't have it, don't worry, just work with string, just as good. I'm going to move to this second one here. Exactly the same thing, posting it through, bending a little circle so that it's not going to come out, and then I'm going to bend it on this side to make sure it stays in place, and I'm going to make a little cut of my wire. So you can start to see how I've now got this moving part. This would work exactly the same with string, just to be clear. But you can start to really see how you can get movement going on, that lovely fishy wiggly thing. And actually, you know, it's worth me pointing out that this could easily be a mermaid tail. If you wanted to explore doing something that's from a fantasy thing, you could make yourself a little human body at the top here with moving arms, and you've got yourself a mermaid. So a couple of other things to think about how you can be inspired working with specific designs. And last but not least, let's put the head on, and then we can have a look at where those fins need to attach onto. So, got my fish together. I'm happy with the way that it's moving and working. And the last thing I want to do is be able to attach the fins into the right place on the puppet. So I'm just going to have a little look. And exactly as I've told you, I've put a scale in the wrong place. So all I'm going to do is, using some sellotape, I roughly know that I want my fins to attach on here and here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sellotape over the hole that I've made on either side, like so. And that means that then I know that I can put a mark where I want the pivot point to be, and it doesn't affect the movement whatsoever. In fact, it's going to be easier for me to make a little hole because I've got some sellotape there instead. So I'm going to put a hole through here. You might need to get a sharper bamboo skewer for that hole through sellotape. There we go. Make sure that's, and then I'm going to hold my fin down and make sure that my one on the other side is even. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to make a hole there. And then I'm ready to put the last pieces of wire through to attach those fins in place. There we go. You've got yourself your koi carp. But the last thing we need to do, obviously, is make sure that we're able to move it using some controls. And obviously what I'm going to be using is these bamboo skewers. So The temptation when you've got to this point is to just get your controls stuck down so that you can just hold it really solidly. But actually, what we want to do, I'll show you with this guy, is I've not stuck it so that they're not able to move. They actually have a, oh, sorry, falling over. They have a hinge. And there's two reasons why. Firstly, it means that you can have a little bit more movement. If they're just stuck rigidly, you end up with something like a lollipop, which means that you're very limited to how you're going to be able to move your puppet. If you put a hinge on them, then it means that you've got a little bit more movement. And also, when you want to pack it up or put it somewhere, you can lay your bamboo skewers flat and you don't have big sharp skewers up in the air. So it's a double-edged thing. So the way that we're going to create a hinge is quite simply, I'm going to take a piece of sellotape and I'm just going to simply fold it, allowing there to be a tab at the top like this. Hopefully you can see that because it's see-through. So you end up with a kind of tab of sellotape like that. And once you've got that, you're going to do that on the other piece of your bamboo skewer as well. And then what we're going to do is you've created a little hinge using the sellotape. So then you can use two pieces of sellotape either side to position it downward. So I'll just pop one more on my other bamboo skewer here. So I'm doing exactly the same thing, leaving a little tab at the end there. And now the last thing that I want to be able to do, I'm just going to cut myself a little bit more sellotape. The last thing that we're going to do is attach it on. And where you put the controls of your shadow puppet are quite important. You need to be able to put a control at the points that you want to be able to move your puppet. So quite often with shadows, you would put them on a moving part. So for example, if you had a mermaid, for example, let's pretend that this wasn't a koi carp, your mermaid might have a moving arm and a moving tail, but you can sometimes work with gravity and you don't need to put a control on certain parts of the puppet. You could just have your mermaid puppet moving like this, and as you can see, I don't need to put a control on it. What it would mean is that I could have a control on my puppet's head to hold her up and one on her arm if she was a mermaid, so that she could maybe wave from the water. In this case, because we're working with a fish, we want to make sure that we have control over either end of the puppet, because that's what allows us to have this lovely swimming movement. You can play around with it. So I'm going to put my control on either end, one in the middle of the head around here, and one on the bottom of the tail around here. We've made our two hinges like this, and we know that we want to attach them around here and here. So you can see that what I'm going to do is hold my hinge in place, and I'm going to take a piece of sellotape and just stick it down. And I'm making sure that what I'm not doing there, so I've given you an example, is I'm not going to tape over that point that we've just made. I'm going to make sure that my sellotape is not restricting any of the parts of the puppet together. Make sure that you're leaving lots of room so that it's able to actually move nicely like this. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side to make sure that it's really securely attached. And I can even make sure that this is going to be folded over really safely like this. So that what you end up with is a bamboo skewer attached onto the puppet that can move either side. And then the same thing on the top here. I'm going to put that down, having a look where I want the bamboo skewer to sit nicely. I'm going to attach on, making sure that I'm not taping down any of the beautiful fins or any of the other parts that we've made. Do the same on the other side here. And once you've done that, your puppet is finished. You've got yourself a koi carp to play with. So at this stage, the really fun part is obviously seeing it in shadow form. And I'm going to see if I can show you just behind me here. Now, obviously the main light that everybody has is the one that's just on their phone. And that is normally a really, really good light source because you want something that's very, very bright from one particular point. I've got a lamp here just to give me a little bit of light as I'm talking to you. And unfortunately, though you can see my silhouette nicely, if I hold my shadow puppet up, it's just a bit blurry. You can't see that detail that we've worked out. And that's to do with the amount of lumens that you have in your light. Lumens is how bright things are. So when you have a very, very, very bright torch at night, it's probably got a very high lumen, whereas something like a lamp in your house, you might not have a brighter one. So if you're at home thinking, why can't I get a nice, crisp, clean shadow? That's why. So I've just turned my torchlight on, and then I start to hold that there. You should be able to see that you can get a much, much more detailed shadow just through working on your phone light. And one of the key things to remember when you're working with shadow puppets, if you bring the puppet towards the light, it's going to get bigger. And if you take the puppet away from the light, then it's going to be smaller. But the really, really fun thing about this is that obviously you could make yourself a series of characters. You could set up your phone. You could work on the ceiling if you'd like, and you can create your very own little shadow puppet show. And if you do that, I would love to see it. You can film that and you can send it in to us so that we can have a look at what you make. But yeah, that's the end of our session today. That's us making our shadow puppetry koi carp, and I hope you've enjoyed it.